The sun was just beginning to rise over the misty Appalachian Mountains, casting a soft golden hue across the hills that Grace Evans had called home her entire life. She stood at the edge of the creek behind her family's cabin, feeling the cool, clear water lap against her bare feet. This place, with its dense woods and hidden trails, had always been her sanctuary, a place where she could forget the worries of the world, even if just for a moment. Her father, James Evans, had taught her to fish in this very creek when she was a little girl, but those days were gone now, swept away like the currents that carried the fallen leaves downstream. He'd passed suddenly, a heart attack taking him in his sleep just a few weeks ago. Grace had barely had time to grieve before the weight of responsibility fell on her slender shoulders. At 22, she was now the eldest of three, and her mother, Ellen, was no longer the strong, determined woman she had once been. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of burning wood and the quiet whispers of morning. Grace walked back inside, her heart heavy as she noticed her younger siblings, Tommy and Sarah, sitting quietly by the fire. Tommy was barely 14, tall for his age, but still with a boyish face, and Sarah was only 10, her pale blue eyes filled with a sadness far too deep for someone so young. Their mother sat at the old kitchen table, staring blankly at the single photograph of James that hung on the wall. Ellen Evans was once a proud woman, with fierce hazel eyes and a sharp mind, but grief had aged her, leaving her with tired lines etched into her face. She turned slowly as Grace entered the room, her gaze distant. "Grace," Ellen said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "we can't keep living like this, not like this." Grace nodded, understanding what her mother meant, but not knowing how to respond. Life had always been hard in the mountains, but without her father's income, it had become a constant struggle to make ends meet. The crops had failed this year, and the little money they made from selling quilts and preserves wasn't enough to keep the roof from leaking or the stove filled with wood for the winter. Ellen sighed, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them on the table. "There's something I never told you," she said, looking up at her daughter with a mixture of shame and hope. We have family, powerful family." Grace frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "Years ago," Ellen began, "before I met your father, my family was tied to the Hillcrest name. They were wealthy landowners, known throughout the region, but when I married your father, I left that life behind. We wanted something simpler, something more real. But now—" Grace listened in silence as her mother told the story. Ellen's family had once been connected to the Hillcrests, a prominent and influential name in the region, but after years of estrangement and distance, the connection had faded, and they had gone unnoticed by the Hillcrests, who still held their vast estates on the other side of the valley. Ellen's voice wavered as she continued. "I never wanted to go back to that world. I never wanted to rely on them for anything. But with your father gone, I'm afraid we don't have any other choice." Grace's heart pounded in her chest. She had always known there was something her mother wasn't telling her, but this was more than she had expected. The Hillcrests were practically legends in the area, their estate perched high above the valley like some kind of fortress. She had heard stories of their wealth and influence, but they had always seemed like a distant, untouchable force, separate from her simple life. "You want me to go to them?" Grace asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Ellen nodded. "You're our only hope, Grace. You're strong, you're capable, and you're smart. If you can connect with them, if they recognize the family tie, maybe they'll help us. Maybe they'll offer us a way out." Grace felt a knot form in her stomach. The idea of leaving her family, her home, was terrifying. She wasn't sure she wanted anything to do with the Hillcrests, especially if they were as cold and distant as the stories claimed. But when she looked around the small, drafty cabin and saw the worried faces of her siblings, she knew she didn't have a choice. They were barely surviving as it was, and winter was coming soon. Grace met her mother's eyes and saw the desperation there. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I'll go," she said, her voice firm. "I'll go to the Hillcrest estate." Ellen reached across the table and took Grace's hands in hers, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I know it's a lot to ask, but I believe in you. You're strong, just like your father." The next morning, Grace packed a small bag with a few simple clothes, an old notebook her father had given her, and a locket with his picture inside. She kissed her siblings goodbye, promising them that she'd be back soon, and set off on foot toward the Hillcrest estate. The air was cool, the leaves on the trees turning brilliant shades of orange and red as fall deepened in the mountains. As Grace climbed the winding path that led up to the Hillcrest estate, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something far bigger than she could imagine. Her heart was heavy with uncertainty, but there was no turning back now. The future of her family rested on her shoulders. When she finally reached the top of the hill, the grand Hillcrest estate came into view. The massive stone mansion, with its towering spires and immaculate gardens, loomed over her like a dark cloud. Grace took a deep breath and straightened her posture. She was about to enter a world she had never known, but she was determined to do whatever it took to secure a better future for her family. And so, with trembling hands but a resolute heart, Grace knocked on the heavy wooden doors of the Hillcrest estate, unaware that her life was about to change forever. The heavy wooden doors of the Hillcrest estate creaked open, revealing a grand entry hall that took Grace's breath away. The floors were polished to a mirror-like shine, reflecting the intricate patterns of the stained glass windows above. Tall, ornate columns framed the room, each one carved with delicate ivy and floral designs. A massive chandelier, dripping with crystals, hung from the ceiling, casting a soft golden light across the room. Grace had never seen such opulence in her life. A man dressed in a crisp black suit stepped forward, his face expressionless as he looked her over. "May I help you, miss?" he asked, his tone polite but distant. Grace swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm Grace Evans," she said, her voice steady, despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. "I've come to speak with Mr. Daniel Hillcrest." The man raised an eyebrow, but said nothing as he motioned for her to follow him. Grace's footsteps echoed in the vast hall as she was led through a series of corridors, each one more elaborate than the last. She felt out of place in her simple dress and worn boots, but she kept her head high, determined not to show any sign of weakness. Finally, they reached a set of double doors, and the man knocked softly before opening them. "Mr. Hillcrest, a Miss Grace Evans to see you," he announced, before stepping aside to let her enter. Grace took a deep breath and stepped into the room. It was a large, sunlit office with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling gardens outside. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, and a grand piano stood in one corner, its black surface gleaming in the sunlight. Behind a massive oak desk sat Daniel Hillcrest, the heir to the Hillcrest fortune. Daniel looked up from the papers he was reviewing, and for a moment their eyes met. Grace was struck by how different he looked from what she had imagined. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark, wavy hair that fell just above his eyes, which were a piercing shade of blue. His features were sharp, almost aristocratic, and there was an air of confidence about him that was both captivating and unsettling. He smiled, a slow, charming smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Miss Evans, it's a pleasure to meet you," he said, rising from his chair and walking around the desk to greet her. "I must admit, I wasn't expecting such a lovely visitor today." Grace blushed, not sure how to respond. She could feel his eyes on her, taking in every detail, and it made her feel exposed, like she was being appraised. "Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Hillcrest," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "I've come on behalf of my family, my mother. She told me that we're distantly related to the Hillcrest family." Daniel's smile widened, and he motioned for her to sit down. "Please, call me Daniel," he said smoothly. "And there's no need to be so formal. We're practically family after all." Grace hesitated, but then took a seat in the plush armchair he offered. She could feel the softness of the fabric beneath her, a stark contrast to the rough, worn furniture she was used to. Daniel returned to his seat behind the desk, folding his hands as he leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. "So," he said, his tone light, "you're here to claim your place among the Hillcrests? I must say, it's been quite some time since anyone's come forward with such a claim." Grace shook her head quickly. "No, I'm not here to claim anything," she said earnestly. "My mother, she only told me about our connection because we're in a difficult situation. My father passed away recently, and we're struggling to get by. I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Daniel. I'm just hoping you might be able to offer some kind of assistance." Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying her with a thoughtful expression. "I see," he said after a moment. "That's a difficult position to be in, and I can tell you're a proud woman, Miss Evans. Grace, you don't want a handout. You want a way to earn your keep." Grace nodded, relief flooding through her at his understanding. "Exactly," she said, feeling a small spark of hope. "I'm willing to work hard. I can do anything that's needed, cleaning, cooking, anything." Daniel smiled again, and this time it felt more genuine, though there was still something in his eyes that made Grace uneasy. "You have spirit, Grace. I admire that. And as it happens, there may be something you can do for me." Grace's heart lifted. This could be it, the chance to help her family, to make things right. "What is it?" she asked, eager to know what he had in mind. "There's a project I've been working on," Daniel said, his tone casual. "Restoring some of the older parts of the estate, bringing them back to their former glory. It's a big job, and I could use someone like you, someone with a fresh perspective who isn't afraid to get their hands dirty." Grace nodded eagerly. "I can do that," she said. "I'm not afraid of hard work." "Good," Daniel said, standing up and walking over to her. He took her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "Welcome to the Hillcrest estate, Grace. I have a feeling you're going to fit in just fine here." As he held her hand a moment longer than necessary, Grace felt a strange mix of emotions. There was a warmth in his touch, a charm in his words, but beneath it all, she sensed something else, something darker, more dangerous. She tried to push the feeling aside, telling herself that she was just being paranoid. After all, Daniel was offering her a chance to help her family, to make something of herself. How could she turn that down? The next few days passed in a blur as Grace settled into her new role at the estate. Daniel was always nearby, offering guidance and advice, his presence both comforting and disconcerting. He seemed to take a special interest in her, often stopping by to chat or offer compliments that made her blush. But there were moments when she caught a glimpse of something else in his eyes, a coldness that made her shiver. Despite her misgivings, Grace couldn't deny that she was drawn to Daniel. He was everything she wasn't, confident, wealthy, powerful, and he seemed genuinely interested in helping her, in making her feel welcome in this strange, new world. But as much as she wanted to trust him, there was a voice in the back of her mind that warned her to be careful. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the estate, Daniel invited her to join him for dinner. Grace hesitated, knowing that she should keep her distance, but she also didn't want to seem ungrateful. She accepted, telling herself that it was just a meal, nothing more. The dining room was grand, with a long table set for two. Candles flickered in the dim light, casting a warm glow on the fine china and crystal glasses. Grace felt out of place in her simple dress, but Daniel reassured her, telling her she looked beautiful. They talked over dinner, Daniel asking about her life in the mountains, her family, her dreams. He listened intently, his blue eyes never leaving hers, and for a moment, Grace almost forgot about the unease she felt around him. But as the evening wore on, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Daniel's interest in her than simple kindness. He was charming, yes, but there was a possessiveness in the way he looked at her, a hunger that made her heart race, not with excitement, but with fear. As the night drew to a close, Daniel walked her to her room, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. "I'm glad you're here, Grace," he said softly, his voice low. "I think you're going to find that the Hillcrest estate has a lot to offer, if you're willing to accept it." Grace forced a smile, nodding as she stepped into her room. "Thank you, Daniel," she said, her voice steady, despite the knot in her stomach. "I'm grateful for everything you've done." He smiled, that same charming, unsettling smile, before bidding her good night. As the door closed behind him, Grace leaned against it, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she needed to be careful, that she couldn't let herself get too close to Daniel, but she also knew that she couldn't leave, not without jeopardizing everything she had come here to do. She was trapped, caught between her duty to her family and the growing fear of what might happen if she let herself fall under Daniel Hillcrest's spell. As she lay down in the unfamiliar bed, the weight of her situation pressed down on her, and for the first time since arriving at the estate, she felt truly alone. The days at the Hillcrest estate settled into a routine that was both comforting and unsettling for Grace. She rose early each morning, the soft light of dawn filtering through her window as she dressed and prepared herself for the tasks ahead. Her duties were varied. Sometimes she worked in the gardens, tending to the sprawling flower beds that surrounded the estate, and other times she helped with the ongoing renovations that Daniel had tasked her with. The work was hard, but honest, and it kept her mind busy, giving her little time to dwell on the growing unease she felt around Daniel Hillcrest. It was during one of these early mornings, while she was weeding a particularly stubborn patch of ground near the estate's orchard, that she first met Jacob Reed. She had been struggling with a particularly stubborn root when a shadow fell across her. Looking up, she saw a tall, broad-shouldered man with a kind smile and warm brown eyes standing before her. He had the rugged look of someone who had spent his life working outdoors, his skin tanned by the sun and his hands calloused from years of labor. "Need some help with that?" he asked, his voice gentle but strong. Grace hesitated for a moment before nodding, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Yes, thank you," she replied, stepping aside to let him take over. With a practiced ease, Jacob knelt down and yanked the root free, tossing it aside before offering her a hand up. "I'm Jacob Reed," he introduced himself, his smile broadening as he helped her to her feet. "I work here on the estate, mostly with the horses, but I help out wherever I'm needed." "Grace Evans," she replied, brushing the dirt from her skirt. I'm not really sure what my job is yet. I guess I'm still figuring it out." Jacob chuckled, a deep, warm sound that made Grace smile despite herself. "You're not the only one," he said. "This place has a way of making people feel a little lost at first, but you'll find your way." From that day on, Grace found herself looking forward to the moments when she would cross paths with Jacob. He was different from anyone she had met at the estate, humble, kind, and completely unpretentious. Where Daniel's charm felt calculated and intense, Jacob's warmth was genuine, and it drew Grace in like a moth to a flame. They began to spend more time together, often working side by side in the gardens or stables. Jacob taught Grace how to handle the horses, showing her how to brush their coats and feed them. He had a natural ease with the animals, and they responded to him with a trust and affection that Grace found deeply endearing. The more time she spent with him, the more she realized how much she enjoyed his company. There was no pressure, no hidden motives, just two people enjoying each other's presence in the quiet, peaceful moments they shared. As the weeks passed, their bond grew stronger. Jacob would often bring her small gifts, wildflowers he had picked from the fields or a piece of fruit from the orchard, and they would sit together during their breaks, talking about everything and nothing. Grace found herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't with anyone else. She told him about her family, about her father's death, and about the pressures she felt to help her mother and siblings. Jacob listened without judgment, offering her a shoulder to lean on when the weight of her responsibilities became too much to bear. But as her feelings for Jacob deepened, so did the tension between her and Daniel. It was as if Daniel sensed the growing connection between them, and it only made him more determined to claim Grace for himself. He continued to shower her with attention, often finding excuses to spend time alone with her. He would invite her to dine with him, to accompany him on walks through the estate, or to join him in the library for a quiet evening of conversation. Each time, Grace found it harder to refuse, knowing that she couldn't afford to offend him or jeopardize the fragile stability she had managed to secure for her family. Yet, despite her best efforts to maintain a distance, Daniel's behavior became increasingly possessive. He would casually place a hand on her arm or shoulder, his touch lingering just a little too long. His gaze would follow her wherever she went, his eyes darkening with something she couldn't quite identify, a mix of desire, frustration, and something far more dangerous. Grace began to feel trapped, torn between her growing love for Jacob and her obligation to Daniel, who held so much power over her future. One evening, after a long day of work, Grace and Jacob found themselves alone in the stables, the soft glow of the setting sun filtering through the open doors. The air was warm, filled with the scent of hay and the quiet sounds of the horses settling in for the night. Grace had been unusually quiet that day, her thoughts heavy with the weight of the decisions she knew she would soon have to make. Jacob noticed her silence and stepped closer, his brow furrowed with concern. "You've been quiet today," he said softly, reaching out to gently brush a stray lock of hair from her face. "Is everything all right?" Grace looked up at him, her heart aching with the conflict that had been tearing her apart for weeks. "Jacob, I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice trembling on with the effort to hold back tears. "I feel like I'm being pulled in two different directions, and I'm afraid of what might happen if I make the wrong choice." Jacob's expression softened, and he took her hand in his touch warm and reassuring. "You don't have to go through this alone, Grace," he said gently. "Whatever happens, I'm here for you. You can trust me." For a moment, Grace allowed herself to lean into him, to take comfort in the strength and kindness he offered. But even as she did, she knew that their relationship couldn't remain in the shadows forever. Daniel was becoming more possessive by the day, and it was only a matter of time before he acted on his growing obsession. Grace knew she needed to make a decision, but every path seemed fraught with danger. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the stable in a dusky twilight, Jacob lifted her chin, his eyes searching hers. "Grace, I care about you," he said, his voice low and sincere. "And I know you feel the same, but I also know how much you care about your family, and I would never ask you to choose between them and me." Tears welled up in Grace's eyes as she looked at him, her heart breaking under the weight of his words. "Jacob, Before she could finish, the sound of footsteps echoed through the stable, and both of them turned to see Daniel standing in the doorway, his face shadowed by the dim light. He said nothing, but the tension in the air was palpable, crackling like a storm about to break. Grace's heart pounded in her chest, fear and guilt twisting inside her as she stepped away from Jacob. Daniel's gaze flicked between them, his expression unreadable. But when he spoke, his voice was cool, almost too calm. "Grace, I was looking for you," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly as they settled on Jacob. "I see you found yourself some company." Grace opened her mouth to respond, but the words stuck in her throat. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, and she could feel Jacob tense beside her, ready to defend her if necessary. But before either of them could say anything, Daniel smiled, a thin, predatory smile that made the hairs on the back of Grace's neck stand on end. "Jacob," Daniel said, his tone polite, but with an edge that cut through the air, "why don't you take the rest of the evening off? I'm sure you've had a long day." Jacob hesitated, glancing at Grace, who gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Reluctantly, he stepped away, his gaze lingering on her for a moment, before he turned and walked out of the stable, leaving Grace alone with Daniel. As the doors swung shut behind him, the silence between Grace and Daniel was deafening. She could feel his eyes on her, could sense the barely contained anger simmering beneath the surface, and for the first time she realized just how dangerous Daniel Hillcrest could be. "Grace," Daniel said softly, stepping closer, his voice low and controlled, "you know I care about you. I've given you every opportunity to succeed here, to secure a future for yourself and your family, but I won't tolerate disloyalty." Grace's breath caught in her throat as he reached out, gently brushing his fingers against her cheek. There was a darkness in his eyes now, a possessiveness that sent a chill down her spine. "I only want what's best for you," he continued, his voice a mix of sweetness and threat. "But you need to remember where your loyalties lie." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes, but she forced them back, refusing to let him see her fear. "I'm grateful for everything you've done, Daniel," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "But I'm not a possession. I'm here to help my family, nothing more." For a moment, Daniel's smile faltered, and the mask he wore slipped, revealing a glimpse of the true man beneath, the man who was capable of anything to get what he wanted. But then, just as quickly, the smile returned, and he stepped back, giving her space. "Of course," he said, his tone light, almost dismissive. "I would never dream of treating you as anything less than an equal. But remember, Grace, everything I do for you. Don't forget that." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Grace alone in the stable, her heart racing and her mind spinning. She knew then that her time at the Hillcrest estate was running out. The tension between her and Daniel had reached a breaking point, and she could feel the storm brewing on the horizon, a storm that threatened to destroy everything she held dear. The night of the tragic event hung over Grace like a shroud, the weight of it pressing down on her every waking moment. The Hillcrest estate, once a place of strange allure, had become a prison, its grand halls and manicured gardens now a labyrinth of suffocating despair. The memory of that night replayed in her mind over and over again, each detail sharp and painful, like shards of glass embedded in her soul. It had started innocuously enough, a dinner just like any other, with Daniel playing the charming host and Grace trying to keep her unease at bay. But as the evening wore on, Daniel's mood had shifted, his charm turning dark and possessive. The wine had flowed too freely, his compliments becoming more pointed, more insistent, until they took on a sinister edge. When she had tried to leave, to excuse herself from the suffocating atmosphere, he had blocked her path, his hand gripping her arm with a strength that belied his calm exterior. "Stay," he had whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "We're not finished." Grace had pulled away, panic rising in her chest, but Daniel was relentless, his eyes dark with a hunger that terrified her. What happened next was a blur. His hands on her, the struggle, the sound of her own voice screaming for help that never came. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over, leaving her broken and numb on the cold floor of his study. The days that followed were a nightmare. Grace had tried to leave, to run far away from the Hillcrest estate and never look back, but Daniel had been one step ahead. He had her watched constantly, his influence extending to every corner of the estate and beyond. No one would believe her, he had said, his voice dripping with cold assurance. She was just a poor girl from the mountains, and he was Daniel Hillcrest, heir to a fortune, respected and feared by everyone in the valley. Her attempts to seek help were met with silence or thinly veiled threats. The staff avoided her gaze, their loyalty to the Hillcrest name stronger than any sense of moral duty. She was alone, isolated, and shamed, her once bright spirit crushed under the weight of Daniel's power. The whispers started soon after, rumors spreading like wildfire through the estate and the surrounding town. Grace Evans, the girl who had tried to climb above her station and failed miserably. The girl who had been foolish enough to think she could stand up to Daniel Hillcrest and survive. The only solace she found was in Jacob. He had been her rock, the one person who believed her without question, who saw through Daniel's lies and manipulation. But even Jacob's support came at a price. Daniel had noticed their closeness, and his jealousy and anger had only grown. He had warned Jacob to stay away, to mind his own business, but Jacob had refused, his loyalty to Grace stronger than any fear of retribution. One evening, when the sky was dark with an approaching storm, Jacob found Grace in the stables, her eyes red from crying, her hands trembling with the weight of her despair. He had heard the rumors, seen the way the staff looked at her with a mixture of pity and disdain, but more than that, he had seen the fear in her eyes, the way she flinched whenever Daniel was near. "Grace," he said softly, reaching out to touch her shoulder, "we need to get you out of here." She looked up at him, her heart breaking at the concern in his eyes. "I can't," she whispered, her voice hollow. "He'll never let me go." Jacob shook his head, his jaw clenched with determination. "We'll find a way," he said firmly. "We'll leave tonight. I'll take you somewhere safe, somewhere he can't find you." Grace wanted to believe him, wanted to hold on to the hope that they could escape and start a new life somewhere far away from the Hillcrest estate. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't be that simple. Daniel's reach was too long, his power too great, and yet, what other choice did she have? To stay was to be condemned to a life of fear and misery, trapped in a gilded cage where her every move was controlled. As the storm began to rage outside, Jacob helped her gather what few belongings she had. They moved quietly through the estate, sticking to the shadows, their hearts pounding with the fear of being caught. Grace's breath came in short, panicked gasps as they neared the back gate, the only exit that wasn't heavily guarded. But just as they reached the gate, a figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking their path. Grace's heart sank as she saw Daniel standing there, his face a mask of cold fury. Going somewhere? Daniel's voice was dangerously calm, his eyes locked on Jacob with a murderous intensity. Grace froze, her mind racing as she tried to think of a way out. But there was no escape, no way to fight back against the man who held all the power. Jacob stepped forward, his fists clenched, ready to protect her, but Daniel merely laughed, a low, mocking sound that sent chills down Grace's spine. "You really think you can take her from me?" Daniel sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "She belongs to me, Jacob, and so do you, whether you like it or not." Jacob didn't back down, his voice steady and defiant. "She doesn't belong to anyone, Daniel. Not you, not me. She's a human being, not a possession." Daniel's eyes flashed with anger, and before Grace could react, he lunged at Jacob, his fist connecting with Jacob's jaw in a sickening thud. Jacob stumbled back, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth, but he didn't fall. Instead, he retaliated, landing a solid punch to Daniel's gut, doubling him over in pain. For a moment, Grace thought they might actually have a chance, that Jacob might be able to overpower Daniel and give them the time they needed to escape. But the fight was short-lived. Two of Daniel's men appeared out of nowhere, grabbing Jacob and pinning him to the ground, their faces expressionless as they held him down. Grace screamed, rushing forward to try and help, but Daniel grabbed her by the arm, his grip like iron. "Enough," he barked, his voice filled with cold rage. "You're coming with me, Grace, now." She struggled against him, her heart breaking as she saw the look of defeat in Jacob's eyes. But it was no use. Daniel's men dragged Jacob away, leaving Grace alone with the man who had destroyed her life. As Daniel pulled her back toward the estate, Grace's mind raced. She knew she couldn't let this continue, couldn't allow Daniel to control her any longer. But what could she do? She had no power, no resources, and every attempt to escape had been thwarted. That night, locked in her room, Grace made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't stay at the Hillcrest estate any longer, but she also couldn't leave without ensuring her family's safety. Daniel had made it clear that he would stop at nothing to keep her under his control, and she knew that the only way to protect her loved ones was to make the ultimate sacrifice. The next morning, Grace sought out Daniel, her heart pounding with the weight of her decision. She found him in the library, calmly sipping his coffee as if nothing had happened. But when he saw the look on her face, he set his cup down, his expression unreadable. "I've made my decision," Grace said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'll stay. I'll do whatever you want, but you have to promise me one thing." Daniel raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And what's that?" "You'll leave my family alone," she said firmly. "You'll make sure they're taken care of, that they have everything they need, and you'll let Jacob go." Daniel studied her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as he weighed her words. Then slowly, a smile spread across his face. "Agreed," he said, his voice smooth and calculating. "As long as you keep your end of the bargain, I'll keep mine." Grace felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was quickly followed by a deep, aching sorrow. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back. Her future was no longer her own, but at least she had ensured the safety of those she loved. As she walked away, her heart heavy with the price she had paid, she couldn't help but wonder if she had made the right decision. The Hillcrest estate once a symbol of hope and opportunity, had become her prison. And now, it seemed, there was no escape. The storm outside mirrored the tempest brewing inside Grace as she made her way to Daniel's study. The halls of the Hillcrest estate, once so grand and intimidating, now felt like the corridors of a prison, and tonight she was determined to break free, no matter the cost. The weight of what she was about to do pressed heavily on her, but the fear that had held her captive for so long had turned to resolve. She couldn't live like this any longer, and she wouldn't let Daniel destroy anyone else's life as he had destroyed hers. Grace burst into Daniel's study without knocking, the door slamming against the wall with a force that echoed through the room. Daniel looked up from his desk, surprise flashing across his face before it was quickly replaced by a familiar mask of cold indifference. "Grace," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "what is the meaning of this?" Her heart pounded, but she didn't hesitate. "This ends tonight, Daniel," she declared, her voice trembling with anger. "I'm done being your pawn, done letting you control me. I'm leaving, and there's nothing you can do to stop me." Daniel's eyes narrowed, and he slowly rose from his chair, his towering figure casting a long shadow across the room. "You think you can just walk out of here?" he sneered. "After everything I've done for you, everything I've given you, you're mine, Grace, and you're not going anywhere." The words hit her like a slap, but instead of cowering, Grace felt a surge of defiance. "I was never yours, Daniel," she shouted, her voice rising with the storm outside. "You don't own me, and you never will. You've done nothing but take from me my freedom, my dignity, my life. But I'm taking it all back. Tonight." Daniel's expression darkened, and he took a menacing step toward her. "You ungrateful little—" he began, but Grace cut him off, her fury boiling over. "Ungrateful?" she spat, her hands trembling with rage. "You think I should be grateful for the hell you've put me through? For the lies, the manipulation, the abuse? You're nothing but a monster, Daniel, and I'm done living in fear of you." For a moment, Daniel was stunned into silence, his eyes burning with barely contained fury. Then, with a snarl, he lunged at her, grabbing her by the arms and shaking her violently. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he hissed, his voice filled with venom. "You're nothing without me. You'd be rotting in that filthy cabin of yours if it weren't for me." Grace struggled against his grip, her heart pounding in her chest, but she refused to let him see her fear. "I'd rather be back in that cabin than spend another minute in this prison," she cried. "You've taken everything from me, Daniel, but you won't take my soul." With a burst of strength born from desperation, Grace wrenched herself free from his grasp, stumbling backward. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, that could give her the upper hand, and then she saw it. The oil lamp on the desk, its flame flickering precariously. Daniel saw her glance at the lamp and sneered. "What are you going to do, Grace?" he taunted. "Burn the place down? You don't have the guts." But he underestimated her resolve. Without thinking, Grace lunged for the lamp, knocking it over and sending it crashing to the floor. The oil spilled out, igniting instantly, and flames began to lick at the edge of the rug, spreading rapidly. Daniel's eyes widened in shock as the fire took hold, quickly engulfing the papers on his desk and climbing up the walls. "Are you insane?" he roared, backing away from the growing inferno. "You'll kill us both!" Grace's eyes blazed with the same fire that was now consuming the room. "Maybe," she said, her voice cold and steady, "but I'd rather die free than live another day as your prisoner." The flames spread quickly, fueled by the dry wood and paper that filled the study. Smoke began to fill the room, choking and thick, as the fire raged out of control. Daniel stumbled back, his face twisted in a mixture of fear and fury. "You're going to regret this, Grace," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. "I'll make sure of it." But Grace was already backing toward the door, her eyes fixed on the fire as it devoured everything in its path. "I regret ever trusting you," she said, her voice low and resolute, "but I won't regret this." With that, she turned and fled the room, the heat of the fire hot on her back. The hallways of the estate were already filling with smoke as she ran, but she didn't stop. The flames had spread faster than she had anticipated, consuming the old wood of the mansion with terrifying speed. Behind her, she could hear Daniel shouting for help, but she didn't look back. Grace burst out of the front doors and into the stormy night, gasping for breath as she stumbled down the steps. The rain was falling in torrents, but it did little to douse the fire that was now raging within the Hillcrest estate. She stood in the driveway, her chest heaving as she watched the flames consume the mansion, the orange glow lighting up the night sky. The storm howled around her, the wind whipping her hair across her face, but she felt nothing but a cold, bitter satisfaction as the fire burned hotter and brighter. The Hillcrest estate, with all its wealth and power, was being reduced to ashes, just as Daniel had tried to reduce her. And now, as the flames roared and crackled, it was all coming to an end. She stood there for what felt like hours, watching the estate burn. The fire was a cleansing force, destroying the physical representation of all that had imprisoned her. It was both terrifying and liberating to see it all go up in smoke. As the first light of dawn began to break through the storm clouds, Grace turned and walked away from the estate, her steps sure and steady. The hills, once her prison, were now her sanctuary. She had faced her demons, and though the cost had been high, she was free. Free from Daniel, free from the past, free to forge her own path. The estate behind her was a smoldering ruin, the once mighty Hillcrest name reduced to nothing more than ashes and memory. But Grace Evans, with the Unforgiving Hills as her witness, had survived, and she would carry on, stronger than ever, with the fire of that night burning in her heart as a reminder of what she had overcome.